Hello, everyone. Welcome to Audubon Society of Central Arkansas's meeting. I'm Dan Scheinman, the Vice President. And tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Coleman Little, who teaches biology at University of Central Arkansas. He has both a bachelor's and master's from UCA. He's also currently a PhD student at the University of Arkansas in the Entomology and Plant Pathology department, where he is researching how habitat management impacts bee communities in different parts of the state. He and his students and agency partners are working to document Arkansas's bees, for which little has been done to date, but now Coleman Little is doing a lot more for our bees. And that's all the bee puns I will do tonight, I promise. And all the little puns. So without further ado, take it away, Coleman.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, I am going to be covering my favorite topic, which is bees. All right, so get things set up on my end. And what I'm going to be covering today is really just a broad overview of native bees, because most of our understanding of bees is kind of centered around bees that are not native. And so my work has been geared towards documenting those native bees and also just trying to educate and let people know about these fascinating and diverse organisms that we have here in Arkansas. So you really kind of have to start with why I care about bees. Now, this is pretty straightforward, and I know talking to a lot of people that care a lot about birds, this might not be as necessary, but it's still really important to point out just how significant these organisms are to our ecosystems around the world. So the statistics that get quoted a lot are that nearly 80% of the flowering plant species that occur in our area require some form of animal-mediated pollination for either reproduction or just to help promote healthy genetics in their populations. Now, this number, that 80%, can vary greatly depending on where you are at. And it gets as high as 98% in some tropical ecosystems. And that would be 98% of those plant species needing some form of animal-mediated pollination. Now, why bees? Well, bees, for the most part, across the board, are better at most of these pollination aspects. So just in general, they're exceptional pollinators. There have been a lot of studies that show more seeds get produced from bees pollinating. Also, the efficiency of pollination increases, and that basically means the number of grains of pollen moving from one flower to another. They go at a higher rate with bees, and in the majority of ecosystems around the world, bees tend to be the most abundant pollinator. Now, that one kind of varies more than the rest. I'm sure that you're aware of islands that say rely on bats for pollination. There are certainly many species that rely on birds for pollination. And then when you get to exceptionally cold areas, like the tops of very tall mountains or Arctic areas, flies, oddly enough, become the dominant pollinator in those ecosystems. But everywhere else, bees are going to be the primary animal conducting pollination. Now, when I ask people what they think of when they think of a bee, I typically get these three answers first, and that is honey comes up very quickly. Hives, just like, a honeybee hive, and just a queen bee with workers and that sort of dynamic. Now, the problem with this is honeybees are really, really strange bees. They do most things differently than the majority of the other bee species that exist. And there's good reason why we focus on honeybees so much. They provide us with honey and wax, right? Most of us have had Honey Nut Cheerios or have seen a bee movie. Their swarms get very dramatic. And then, I don't even really know what this guy here is doing, but there's certainly a lot of visibility on honeybees. And in about the year 2010, colony collapse disorder, which is just the sudden unexplained disappearance of honeybee hives, it really took spotlight and had a lot of people very concerned about protecting bees. However, our focus really should have been, at least in my opinion, should have been more on native bees that are quite a bit different from these honeybees. So when I ask people, well, what do you know about bees that aren't honeybees? Bumblebees. That's usually the next bee that will come up, and it's a native bee, and it's is in this world that I'm talking about. But bumblebees are also very, very strange. They're extremely large. And they still have a queen and worker social system. And so that is rare in bees and is not the common behavior. Okay, so even though we're getting native, we're still talking about a pretty strange bee. Now, the other one that I get sometimes, with a little bit of anger, is carpenter bees. Now, these are the ones that kind of bore into people's decks or porches, and they can be a pest in that manner. This, again, is a native bee. It's an extremely large bee, but at least with carpenter bees, they don't have queens and workers, and we are starting to get a bit closer to what native bees here in Arkansas are. And then if I get someone that is more aware of some of these bees, they might, maybe with some aggression too, mention sweat bees. They're called sweat bees because they will go after the salt that is in your sweat. And if you are sweating a lot, which you tend to do in this humidity that we have here in Arkansas, they get trapped in your sweat, think that they're going to die, and they kind of sting you. And it's not that painful, but it's certainly startling. And that is at least a native bee that kind of fits most of these categories I'm trying to describe. However, it's supposed to refer to this family of bees. Okay, that is what a sweat bee is supposed to be. However, sweat bees have just kind of become a small metallic bee. That's what it means to people. And the issue with that is that description of small and metallic can be found, and I have them pictured here at the bottom, across 3 different families of bees. So very, very different bees, all falling under this description that people give as a sweat bee. All right, so if we take the average understanding of what bees are and compare that to all the other bees that are in existence, it looks something like this. Here is a proportional bar chart with all of the bee species that are known represented. The approximate 260 species of honeybees and bumblebees make up this very small portion of what all bees are, which we have actually over 20,000 bee species documented. And like I said, the majority of them are very different from this tiny piece of this this red piece of this proportion. They are nesting differently. They are interacting with each other differently. And so it's really unfortunate that our understanding of this incredibly important group is in such a small proportion of these species, especially when that proportion is so different from the rest. So I actually give a talk that it's probably a little over an hour long, that is just going over the huge amount of diversity of bee species that we have here in Arkansas. I don't have time for that with this presentation, and so I'm more taking the time to present this slide of there are a lot of different types of bees out there. They look different, and some of them even look more like wasps than what you might actually think a bee would look like. So these are flying around all over Arkansas, and most people don't even notice them because they don't present themselves to most people as a bee. So what is a bee? Well, these are some technicalities here. It is a part of this order of insects that includes ants, wasps, velvet ants, and sawflies. That's a pretty broad category. Right? And if I'm to get technical, it is characteristics that do with this single plate that is on their exoskeleton called the pronotal lobe. The pronotal lobe is this small little piece right here. Right? That is technically what makes a bee a bee. I don't think I have ever really just looked for that. It's not necessarily a useful characteristic. People aren't running around looking for that plate. So most of our understanding of bees and looking at something as a bee, it's more in its behavior. You'll also see scopa on most. And this is one of the reasons why it's that real obscure characteristic, because I am going to say most a lot during this presentation, because bees always seem to have exceptions. Anything that you might think all bees do, there is likely an exception. So a scopa, that is this hair structure on their legs, and they use it to collect pollen. Now, scopa can be present in a few places. It can be on the underside of basically their belly, on their abdomen. It can also be on the back of their thorax. Right? So they can have scopa in many different places, but no males have scopa. And then there are several species that neither the male or the female have scopa. So that doesn't always hold up. But if you see an insect flying around with really concentrated areas of pollen, that is a bee. Most of the females have this modified egg-laying structure that we call a stinger. And that's one of the things that bees are most known for. But there are hundreds of species that do not have a stinger at all. So that doesn't even hold up for the whole group. Again, there are a lot of exceptions. So looking further at bees, there are 7 families of bees. But within those families, there is a lot of diversity. Right? 7 families isn't necessarily a lot, but 450 different genera is quite a bit. And the last count I've seen for predicted number of species of bee in the world is 26,000. But we are at around 21,000 documented at this time. And then again, most bees are going to be very strict vegetarians. What that means for a bee is pollen and nectar, pretty much all they eat. But pollen, specifically for a bee, is their only source of nitrogen. Nitrogen is how life makes proteins. And so the only way that they can make proteins, that's how you grow and develop, is through the consumption of pollen. This makes them very connected and tied to plants, and is one of the reasons they are such important pollinators. But I said most, right? There is an exception to just about everything, like I was saying. We know of 3 species in Panama. They do collect pollen, but they also collect carrion, which is rotting dead flesh. So they will go to dead animals and collect that to supplement their pollen intake. These are called vulture bees. Again, they are the only bees that we know of that aren't strict vegetarians. Obviously, they are in Panama, so we don't have to can really consider them here in Arkansas. But I think it helps highlight how bees are just incredibly diverse, and within them there's an exception to about anything that you can think of. Right. So one question I get quite a bit as I am trying to convince people why they should care about bees. A lot of people do at least care about bees, but then why aren't honeybees enough? Well, there have been a lot of studies to this point that have shown with enhancing native bee communities, you will increase your crop yields. And even more, you will increase your profits by even spending money to enhance the bee communities. I will say some studies do show that no increases occur, right? But that is more indicative of the complexity of these systems. And that complexity falls in how these bees are foraging, where these different hair structures are located on their body, and the structure of the flowers. So if you just think about flowers in general, there's a huge diversity there, right? I have diagrams here of what, at least in my mind, what 2 extremes are. A lily sort of flower, where you have the pollen out on these anthers, very separated from the female portion, which is the stigma. Very, very different structure compared to a sunflower that has several different flowers with the male and female parts very close to one another. And you can very easily imagine how a particular bee species might be more effective at pollinating this flower versus that one. And when you really consider the wide diversity of flowers that are just growing in Arkansas, it's a little easier to understand why we need to promote and enhance all of the different bee species that we have here in Arkansas. So these aren't necessarily all native. I mean, this is a Cattleya orchid, but rattlesnake master, very strange looking flower. Bees love it. This passion flower is a very strange floral setup in which Arkansas, we even have specialists for them. Now at the bottom, these are all crop flowers. We have blueberries over here on the right. Soybeans are obviously a very important crop here in Arkansas, and many of our native pollinators are much more efficient with soybean and just bean structured flowers than are honeybees. And then there are these occasional examples like the tomato that require something called buzz pollination. And what that means is they require a bee to land on the flower and vibrate their wings at a particular frequency, and that releases the pollen for them to collect. If those flowers don't experience that frequency, they do not release their pollen. So honeybees don't actively dislodge pollen in that manner and are not nearly as good of a pollinator for things like tomatoes. But then you have to consider the varied structures that pollinators have. Here we have a fly, again, extremely important pollinator. If there is a second place behind bees for important pollinators, it hands down goes to flies. They are way less hairy than bees are, and that's actually probably the only reason they aren't as good of pollinators. But they visit a lot of different flowers and transfer a lot of pollen in the process. Beetles are underappreciated because they also, or many species of beetle, visit flowers and transfer quite a bit of pollen. Bats, like we mentioned before, are going to have a very different efficiency with different flowers. And I think that one is a little bit easier to understand. And then looking at the ones that people think about more readily, butterflies, they have the long proboscis, and they transfer a bit of pollen, right? But there's a lot of diversity there with butterflies, and say a monarch that is migrating is going to pollinate in a much different way than other butterflies that might be present. And then just within bees, there is a massive amount of variation in their ability to transfer pollen. We have here the face of a bee that is very hairy. Now, bees stick their faces in flowers most of the time that they are foraging, and that hair on their face is one of the main modes that pollen will actually transfer. But you can look at other bee species that don't have nearly as much hair on their face. It doesn't necessarily mean they won't be as good of a pollinator, but it definitely means for the flowers that are relying on transferring pollen on the face of a bee are going to have a harder time with those bees that don't have as much hair there. And just in a broad sense, we can look at how bees interact with these different flowers, and all of this just really becomes clear. Here in the middle, this is a bumblebee, and bumblebees and honeybees are in a category of bee that what they do is they mix the pollen with nectar, and they make a ball of pollen and they stick it on their legs. That pollen, when it's mixed with nectar, will not transfer to a flower. Right? That pollen is not going to pollinate any flower. The pollination is going to occur on this hair that's located elsewhere on this bee. But if we look at other native species that don't wet that pollen with nectar, this pollen is loose and can very easily transfer to a flower. Then we have a lot of bee species that carry their pollen on their belly, the underside of their abdomen. And that one is even easier to imagine. You can even see how this one is just kind of dragging that pollen along the surface of these multiple flowers produced by that plant species. And then I think I'm a fan of showing extreme examples because here we can see a honeybee getting nectar out of a hibiscus flower. Right, and like I said, this is an extreme. It's obvious in this situation that no pollen is going to be transferred. The female parts are way up here. The pollen is over there, and that bee is completely detached. Though that is an extreme, we have a range that goes from very direct contact with these scopa and the flower all the way to this extreme and everywhere in between. So say if your crops are something like a hibiscus flower, you're not necessarily going to benefit from enhancing your native bees. You would want to try to enhance a pollinator that was more efficient for a hibiscus flower. But the majority of crops do benefit from enhancing native bees. And the answer to enhancing your native bees is pretty simple. Enhance your plant community. When you have a large amount of flowers and a lot of different types of flowers, you typically see a similar response in your bees. So this sort of habitat is what you would be aiming for if you were trying to promote bees. More flowers and more different types of flowers. But there are a few more aspects that at least are important with understanding bees and understanding how to enhance them. So one of the things to consider is nesting. It's great enhancing their food, which is the flower portion, but they need a place to reproduce and raise their young for the next generation. As the animation got a little messed up there, but they also will have different reproductive rates. So go ahead and mention that, but back to nesting. As they are nesting, they are going to be interacting with each other in different ways, and that can really impact how you might be trying to enhance them. And where they nest is going to dictate how far they fly away from their nest to look for that food. And then mention this one plenty, flowering species presence. But one thing that is often not considered is the time of year that these flowers are blooming. Some bees are only present for a brief period of time, and you want flowers to be present when they are flying around. So going to the reproductive rates, most bees are just going to go through a single generation in a year. And they will just overwinter in one way or the other. Sometimes they emerge as an adult and wait throughout the winter. Other times they stop while they are a pupa and then emerge as an adult in the spring. But most of them are just going to go through a single generation. However, there are some bees that can go through 2 generations in a year, and the highest number that's been documented was 7 generations of a single bee species within a year. And so if you are having multiple generations, you are needing to provide new nesting resources for each of those generations. And really, the number of bees just increases more and more throughout the year. But going back to the social behaviors, and this is how they interact with one another, there is a wide range. And what I have pictured here is what we typically think of, where you have a queen, a worker, and a male. That's eusocial. That's what honeybees are and bumblebees are. But even that doesn't really describe the range that you get within that. There is this category that we call primitively eusocial. And what that is there's an individual that is reproducing, either the only one that is reproducing or much more than all the other bees, but there's no visible difference. With a queen bumblebee, it is a very different size and it looks very different from workers. With primitively eusocial, we're not positive why that individual is laying the eggs and the other ones are gathering pollen for this different individual. That is still unclear to us. But then there's also this sub-social category. This gets even more complex. And the way to look at this is within a single species, one individual might decide to go set up a primitively eusocial group and will have that eusocial dynamic where it's not clear which is the queen or worker just by looking at them. But then other individuals of that same species will not. They will just go and live solitary. They will live by themselves. So you even get differences in these social behaviors within individual species. Again, further complicating just bees and what they are. Semi-social is a very, I would say this is the most rare social behavior that bees have. Those carpenter bees that bore into patios and decks, they are semi-social. And the best way to describe these bees is they live in a commune. I joke sometimes calling them communists because they live collectively. All the individuals take part in protecting the nesting area. All the individuals bore out nests. They might even share nest entrances with each other. They will collect pollen for each other, and they kind of just collectively do everything for each other. Very interesting, and like I said, a very rare social behavior in bees. My favorite is parasitic. And part of the reason it's my favorite is that sounds confusing. How can a vegetarian be parasitic? Well, these bees will find their host species which will be a bee, and they lay their egg in that species' nests. Their egg will hatch first, and their larva will come out and eat all of the pollen that the other species has gathered, and then emerge as an adult. By the time the host species egg hatches, there isn't any pollen remaining. And it's something we call kleptoparasitism, because they are stealing the resources of another species. I forgot I even added this one in there. There's also social parasites. These are individuals that will go into a eusocial hive, kill the queen, and start behaving as that hive's queen, but laying her eggs, just manipulating the other species workers to gather resources for this parasite's eggs. Very interesting that there's even different levels of parasitism there. And then the most common is solitary. About 70% of bee species are solitary, and they can be solitary in some different ways. There are aggregations where they just seem to nest in clusters. When they do this, we're unsure if they're nesting in a cluster because the resources that they need to nest are clustered, or if they actually enjoy nesting next to each other. But for whatever reason, they nest in clusters. And then communal is, it's like an apartment building. Different individuals will share an entrance. They will share a way to their apartment, you could call it. But they are responsible for their own area that they maintain and lay their eggs. But they're all sharing the same entrance. And so, again, a very wide range in how bees interact with each other. Now, what they're doing when they're nesting differs quite a bit as well. There are many different categories, including tunnel nesting, soil nesting, which, again, that's going to be the most common. About 70% of bee species nest in the soil. A small percentage of bees bore out the pith, the inner core of herbaceous plant stems, and then they build their nests within that. Your carpenter bees bore into dead wood. There are only a few bee species around here that do that. And then your cavity nesters are building hives inside of larger cavities. But getting back to soil, the composition of that soil really matters at which species is going to be nesting in that area. So this is a soil composition pyramid. On this side, we have percent clay from 0 to 100, percent silt from 0 to 100 here, and percent sand from 0 to 100 down here. And a few things that you can tell from this figure is, one, bees really like sand, but they don't like just sand. They want it mixed with something a little different. A little bit of clay. They definitely prefer silt more than clay in general, but each of these points represents a different species and their preference for the composition of the soil that they nest in. So different species are going to want a different composition of soil. And then what they are doing in the soil is very different among each species. We have studied a few of these, and you can see some of the designs here. I have this slide that shows some of the other things that we have discovered. We don't know the full variety of nests in the soil, But we do know that every time we have looked at different species nest structure, they have always been different. And so each of these species are finding different compositions of soil, and they are building very different structures within them. Sam Droege, who is USGS just outside of DC, has been playing around with native bee houses for soil nesting species. And I really like some of his approach. He will take old containers like this styrofoam ice chest or this flower pot that he was not using and stuff them with particular soil compositions and just leave them in dry areas. And he's had pretty good success getting some of these soil nesting bees. Now, I will warn you, if you do attempt this, try to keep these nests small and spread out. He did do a massive wall of this soil, and woodpeckers came in and absolutely decimated the bees that had nested in that wall. And so if you put too many of these bee nest structures in a single area, you are inviting parasites, they're not parasites, predators, to come in to the area, and spreading them out still allows those predators to have some food without completely wiping out the nesting population. Dead wood borers, we pretty much, there's a couple more in Arkansas, but these are the most notable. This is the southern carpenter bee, and that one does not bore into your deck. At least it hasn't been documented doing so. It will just bore into like fallen logs or tree limbs. But this one is the eastern carpenter bee, and that is the one that is has been a pest for a lot of people's decks and porches. And they make these galleries. That's what's pictured over here on the side, in which they nest in. Like I said, they kind of build these together and will even share these different areas and lay eggs right next to each other. But that's what they're doing when they are boring into lumber. A close relative are what we call these small carpenter bees. These are ones that find these herbaceous stems, bore them out, and then they make their nests inside of that. For these bees, it is important to not chop down this dead vegetation, at least down to the ground. I hear a lot of people recommending leaving a foot to 18 inches for these. This would be like a goldenrod stem, a little hiatus or a blazing star stem, and leaving them out throughout the year, allowing these bees a good nesting resource. Then we have tunnel nesters, and these will they will build a nest anywhere they can. Any cavity that fits the dimensions that that species needs, they might build their nest there. So this could be in the cracks of rocks. It could be in the exit holes of from other insects in, say, a dead tree. It could even be in these cracks of this dead tree. I've even extracted a nest from in between a rain gutter and a brick wall. So if the size is right, they could potentially build a nest there. And what they're doing inside of those tunnels, a few things. At the top here, this is a leaf cutter bee, and it cuts leaves to make this nest structure. This is a resin bee, and they produce a resin and a organ that they have, and this provides a waterproof structure for those bees. And then here at the bottom, this is what a mason bee does. They're called mason bees because they will chew up leaves, mix them with mud, and make this adobe-like substance that they make their nests out of. And you can see in some of these, those are bee larvae, and those are pupa. I can't really see it with the leafcutter bee. These are the species that are targeted with these bee houses. Now, these bee houses are becoming very popular, and they can be good, but then there's a lot of bad ones out there. I pulled these two images from Amazon, and the biggest red flag to notice is that the bees pictured here are all honeybees, which the honeybees would not enjoy this structure whatsoever. These are not designed for honeybees. And so be cautious with these. Very often the holes are way too big for these native bees, or they are made with treated lumber. This varnish has the potential of leaching chemicals into the larva or pupa and can cause damage to those bees. So what I recommend is using materials that you have on site and drilling holes in them. This picture, those holes are still a bit too big. Here in Arkansas, I wouldn't go above 3/8 of an inch drill bit. But if you get multiple different sizes and just drill holes into wood and put that wood in a relatively dry place, you will likely end up with bees nesting in them at some point. Real quickly, just mention cavity nesters. These just need a large cavity to build a nest in. This is what honeybees need, but also bumblebees. Bumblebees will not make their own cavity. They will find an empty one. So these bumblebees have set up in a rodent nest that was empty. And so these bees do require those larger cavities that already exist in order to set up a nest. The other important thing to consider is the size of the bee. All right, we typically measure this from the base of the wings, but the larger the bee, the farther it is going to be capable of flying to gather food. And why that matters is there's a huge size difference in bees. This is the smallest bee in North America, and this is the largest bee in North America. And so their ability to fly can vary greatly as well, and is something to consider if you are trying to promote bees in your area. So if you are to imagine bees across a landscape and say you are managing this garden area in this image, you will have some bees that have very small foraging ranges. And everything that you do is going to impact their life. You'll have other bees with slightly larger foraging ranges, but you still might be in full control of every plant that they are even capable of visiting. And then again, there's going to be larger ones, and they could be impacted from things that are off-site or attracted to things that are off-site. And then you just keep getting bigger to a point where you can get bees coming in from great distances that could be visiting your flowers. So you have this layered system of how far bees are flying and where they are going when they are foraging. And it's a really important thing to consider when you are trying to promote these species. So flower species diversity is a huge thing that is going to impact your bee diversity. And it's pretty simple. I've said this already, but the more different flowers you have, the more different bees you are going to have. And the main thing to consider there, I'm going to skip through that real quick. We can get back to it if you have questions, but the main thing to consider with this is the time of year that different flowers may be blooming. So this is a graph from Florida where they have bees flying year round. So this wouldn't necessarily be the case here in Arkansas, but this does highlight the fluctuations in the number of different bee species that you have from moment to moment throughout a year. Some bees only fly for about 2 weeks out of the year. And that's one of the things that is contributing to these spikes that are in this graph, are those bees that are only present for a brief period of time. So the time of year that a flower is blooming is very, very important to consider. If you are trying to promote bees, you want as many different times of the year represented, but you also should consider time of day. Most bees only move around during the day, but we do have nocturnal bees here in Arkansas. That honestly is a fairly recent discovery, and we are still trying to figure out what plant species those nocturnal bees are going to, but it is still something very important to consider. So just real quick, how to enhance bee communities? Increase the flower diversity. That one is straightforward, but make sure as you are doing that, you are considering throughout the year and not just number of plants or number of different species. The time of year that they are blooming is very important. And then also, when you are considering different plants, different genera are more important to bees than a different species. When bees specialize in a flower and only visit, say, a flower, a species or two, it's usually not as much of a species as it is a genus, and that is just the flower structure. And so more different types of flowers are going to be better. And then increasing the nesting resources, the diversity of what is available. And that can be the diversity of your soil, not just having a single soil composition across your landscape, having areas that are more or less sandy, leaving those dead herbaceous stems. All of that is going to contribute to a more diverse and healthy bee community. And so with that, I can take any questions y'all might have.
Thank you, Coleman. And to remind everybody, you can either post your question in the chat, or you can take yourself off of mute to ask your question. I'll start off. I was wondering if sweat bees might be poisoned by sunscreen or bug spray on our skin.
You know, I don't know if anyone has looked into that. I am completely unsure if anyone has looked into that. I would imagine so. It's certainly not good for humans to ingest it. And I mean, with all of those chemicals, there has to be some impact, but unsure what that might be.
A question from the chat: are non-native flowers sold by retailers a big problem?
A big problem for what exactly? That's a complicated one. So I guess, let's see. Retailers are typically, when you're buying a plant for its flowers, it's going to have very large floral displays, big flowers, a lot of flowers. And in a sense, that could be good for a bee species or 10 bee species. But those plants in general are not going to provide the nesting resources and the same quality of pollen. And most of the research shows that those plants are preferred by honeybees. And so those flowers are going to help honeybees more than native bees. But I can't necessarily say they're completely bad because there are native species that do gather resources from those plants. But native plants instead of those ornamental plants are going to provide more better resources for the natives.
Yep, native flowers support native insects, and native insects in turn feed the birds. And speaking of native plants, you mentioned cutting stems and leaving some stems. I just did that in my native plant garden over the weekend. I cut the standing dead vegetation, but I did it at various heights and I left a lot of standing stems, which also saves time. I used to grab every single stem and cut them all at the base, and it would take me many days to clear my garden. Now I know that's not a good thing. It's so much easier to just take a big clipper and just very loosely cut the stems and leave a lot of mess, leave a lot of stems on the ground to decompose, provide a lot of nesting structures for bees, and provide a lot of compost for my yard. So a big time saver in addition to providing habitat for bees.
Yeah, and the bees that do that they become very abundant and therefore very important pollinators for the state. But I will add to that, some people say that they want those removed for the look of having them removed. And so if that's the way that you are feeling, I would attempt, and we don't know exactly how well this works, but taking small bundles of what you remove and kind of scattering those, maybe even kind of in the back of flower beds, would at least be better than nothing there.
What made you so passionate about bees?
I'm from Arkansas, and I absolutely love the wildlife in this state. I kind of stumbled upon them in trying to figure out what master's thesis project I wanted to do. And I very quickly realized we didn't know very much about these in Arkansas. And I just very quickly became passionate to protect them because of how important they are and because how much I care about the wildlife that we have in this state. And that's about as much as I can think about that one. It just kind of happened. I love bees, and as soon as I realized how much work we needed to do here in Arkansas, I haven't thought about it very much since. I've just been loving them. So
Do you have a favorite bee?
I have a favorite family, but no, there's not one. No, that would be too difficult.
What's your favorite family?
My family it's Megachilidae, which that contains the leafcutter bees, the ones with the really big mandibles. But my favorite thing about them is they have gorgeous eyes. This bee that's being pictured here, this is a mason bee, and it's one of them. And there's just something about their eyes that I just love looking at. And I look at a lot of bees under a microscope, so I just really like them.
If someone has a bee allergy, Are they allergic to the stings of all bees, or does the venom vary by species?
The venom varies greatly. I don't think I don't think anyone would be comfortable enough as just saying like, oh no, not at all. I suppose it would be possible to be allergic to all of them. But if you are allergic to, say, a honeybee, that does not mean you would be allergic to any of these other native bees. Um, and I've been stung by some of these bees, and most of these native bees, you can't even feel them. The only way I could tell that they had stung me was a very, very small whelp formed on my skin, but I couldn't even feel it. And so a lot of native bees, that's all it's going to be. And yeah, their venom will vary quite a bit.
Do you use any of your recommended bee enhancing tips at your own house?
Yes, I live in the middle of Conway, and they have kind of fairly strict ordinances, or I would just be letting my yard go free. But I have a few raised beds. Each of the raised beds have a little bit different of a sand composition to them. And they all have plants that were seeded from some of the native prairies that are in the immediate area. And the nest, the leaf cutter nest that I said I collected between the brick wall and the rain gutter was at my house. And so I wish I could do more, but sometimes living in a town, it can be a little bit more difficult.
How can someone keep track of the bees that are in their area?
I am working on something. We are trying to develop a rapid bee assessment is one thing to kind of assess the habitat, but also allow people to kind of make observations. And so I'm working on something somewhat concrete, and hopefully it will be a little bit, it'll be a couple years at the most before we're sending that out a little bit more. But otherwise, iNaturalist is fantastic. We have actually discovered a lot of bee species through iNaturalist here in Arkansas. And we found some pretty unusual things through iNaturalist. iNaturalist can't identify the majority of bees, but it's still making a lot of observations. And there are a lot of bee experts that get on iNaturalist. And that, I think, is the most immediate way because not always, I definitely haven't looked in a couple months, but when spring and summer comes around, I'll be on iNaturalist quite a bit. And I know several other experts that do as well.
Is the yellow jacket a native bee, and are there any endangered bee species in Arkansas?
So the yellow jacket is a paper wasp. It is more similar to the red wasps that like to build their nest right next to your front door, or a hornet. That's more what a yellow jacket is going to be. They might collect a little pollen, but they are mostly going to be collecting spiders and other animals like that to feed their young. That's where they get their protein. We do not currently have a listed bee here in Arkansas. The only endangered bee that we have in North America is the rusty patch bumblebee. And we don't have any documentation that it was ever here in Arkansas. But we do have 3 bee species that are currently being petitioned to be listed as threatened or endangered. And those are all bumblebees. I don't think I only think one of them will actually be listed, but that's the current status.
Well, there's clearly a lot we still don't know about our native bees. So I'm glad that you are out there studying bees. I appreciate you, Coleman. Thank you for sharing your passion with us. I also want to thank Sherilyn King for her ASL interpretive skills tonight. Thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in to our presentation. If you would like, you're welcome to stay on for the business portion of our meeting.
Thank you all for having me. I always love talking about bees.